The notary leaned across her desk and whispered it, as if the copier behind us could hear. I'm sorry. Records show you're divorced. I had buried my father 9 weeks earlier. I had been a millionaire for less than an hour. I did not correct her. For Mix, I asked for a certified copy of whatever she was reading, paid the fee in cash, and carried the envelope out to my car the way you carry something that might spill. By autumn, for 3 years. By autumn, his own attorney would be telling him to take the deal and be grateful for it. But, that morning, I just sat in the parking lot with the engine off, reading a case number I had never seen in my life. Good day, dear listeners. It's Bella again. Before we go on, tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I read every single one. And if stories like mine stay with you, subscribe so the next one finds you. Now let me tell you how it started. I used to think I was lucky. Not lucky in the loud way, not lottery lucky. Just quietly fortunate. A good house, steady work I loved, a marriage that ran smoothly enough that I never thought to lift the hood. Then, in a single winter, I lost my father, inherited more money than I knew how to think about, and learned from a stranger in a cardigan that my marriage had legally ended 4 years earlier without my knowledge. People say money changes everything. I don't believe that anymore. Money changes nothing. Money is a flashlight. It doesn't build the room. It only shows you the furniture that was always there. This is the story of what that light showed me, and what I did once I could finally see. My name is Carolyn Langford. I'm 42 years old, and I live in Richmond, Virginia, in a brick house on a street, where the oaks are older than everyone under them. My husband and I bought the house 12 years ago, 2 years into our marriage. His name is Daniel Hargrove. He kept his name and I kept mine, which people found modern of us. He was 45, a regional sales director for a building products distributor, the kind of man who could talk to anyone about gutters. His territory ran east, toward the coast, what people here call tidewater, and the job kept him on the road. I'm a senior acquisitions editor at a small independent publisher called Marrow and Lane. I find books before they are books. It is careful work, and it made me a careful person. I read contracts for a living. I read signature pages the way other people read faces. And I keep everything, every version of every agreement, dated, in order. Every April I fly to London for the Spring Rights Fair, the 1 week a year I plan my whole calendar around. Daniel used to say he could set his watch by my April. We never had children. That was a grief once, a long time ago, and then it became simply the shape of our life. We had Biscuit instead, a brown mutt, with a gray chin and the manners of a diplomat. We had our rituals. Sunday nights we did the crossword in pen, Daniel's idea, because he said pencils were for people who planned to be wrong. In the hallway hung a small photograph of my father in a pewter frame, and every morning I straightened it, and by evening it had gone crooked again, and I never once found out why. In the garage sat a can of deep green paint I'd bought for the study 3 years running, because I wanted one dark, quiet room in the house. And every year Daniel said, dark rooms feel smaller, and every year the can stayed where it was. My father was Walter Langford. He built a printing and packaging company from a rented garage into a plant that employed 90 people. And he died in January, in the parking lot of that plant. His heart stopping between his car and the door he'd walked through for 40 years. He was 74. My mother had been gone a decade, and I was his only child, and so what he built came to me. And I've been married for 3 years. Nights after the funeral, the appraisals were finished. His partners bought out his stake in the company for $6,380,000. His house on its hill above the river appraised at $742,500. His accounts came to $892,272. All of it together was $8 million. $8,014,772, if you want the number the way I keep numbers. A millionaire overnight, people said. And I suppose that was true, though the night in question took my father with it. My neighbor Peggy, a retired school nurse with a laugh you could hear across 2 yards, brought casseroles that winter and never once asked how much. And I've been married for 3 years. Daniel's oldest friend was Curtis, who ran closings at a title agency out toward Mechanicsville and still sent Daniel golf invitations in fat white envelopes. That was our world. Small, warm, in order. If you had asked me that winter whether my marriage was solid, I would have said yes. I would have said we were fine, and I would have believed every word of it. Looking back is a kind of archaeology, and I've been married for 3 years. You dig through your own years with a soft brush, and things you walked past 100 times turn out to have edges. There were 3 of them. I ignored all 3, and I had a good reason every time. The first was the taxes. 4 springs ago, Daniel came home with a folder and a plan. From now on, we would file separately. Cleaner for his travel deductions, he said. His accountant had run the numbers. And did I really want to spend March gathering receipts for gutters sold in 3 states? I signed my own return that year and every year after, and I told myself my husband was careful. Detail-oriented men are careful. That is what detail-oriented means. The second was the Tuesdays. His overnights in the Tidewater territory had always come and gone. But in those same 4 years, they hardened into a schedule. Tuesday and Wednesday, most weeks, a duffel bag that lived permanently in his trunk, a second phone charger that never left his car. When the company merged with a competitor, his territory nearly doubled, and I told myself that ambitious men sleep near their accounts. He always called at 9. A man who is hiding something does not call at 9, I would have said, as if the call were the marriage. The third was the Christmas card. 2 winters ago, an envelope arrived at our house addressed to Daniel and Dana Hargrove, and I've been married for 3 years. I stood in the kitchen holding it, and I remember the small cold second before he laughed and took it from my hand. It was from his old college roommate Glenn's household, and Glenn's wife, Daniel said, had never once gotten a name right in her life. She calls me Danny, he said. She probably thinks the dog is named Carolyn. He dropped card in the recycling with the flyers, and I let the cold second go because people are bad with names, and because the alternative was not a thought I knew how to hold. Separate taxes. Standing Tuesdays. A stranger's name folded next to his on a Christmas card. 3 small things, and each one had its own reasonable little house to live in, and for 4 years none of them ever visited each other. Then, on 3 years, on the second Tuesday of March, 9 weeks after I buried my father, all 3 of them moved into the same house. I have learned since that the truth does not arrive like a storm. The truth arrives like an invoice. It simply shows up, itemized, and asks to be paid. And I've dirtied for 3 years. The second Tuesday of March, at 20 minutes past 10 in the morning, I sat in the offices of Ferris and Vale Settlement Services to sign my father's house into my name. And I've been married for 3 years. This was housekeeping, the last of the estate paperwork, a room with gray carpet, and a clock above the copier, and March light the color of dishwater coming through the blinds. The settlement officer was a young man who said perfect every time I signed something. Something. The notary was a woman in her 60s in a mustard cardigan, and she was the one running the title and judgment search, because before they record a deed, they check the record of the person receiving it. On the intake form, under marital status, I had written married. I watched her read her screen, then read it again. Then she leaned across the desk and whispered, as if the copier behind us could hear. I'm sorry. Records show you're divorced. She turned the monitor a few inches toward me. Hargrove versus Langford. Final decree. Calder County Circuit Court. Entered 4 years ago this spring. Would you like us to update the vesting to reflect that? She asked gently, the way you speak to someone who has forgotten something embarrassing about her own life. It was 10:41 by the clock above the copier. I remember the weight of my father's fountain pen in my hand, and I've been married for 3 years. I remember the laminate desktop cold under my palms, and the copier drum turning somewhere behind me, and the notary's stamps sitting upright on its ink pad like a small, patient animal. I remember thinking, with a strange, distant courtesy, so that is what my name looks like on a divorce. Was I going to drive home and ask my husband whether we were married? No. I was going to find out first, the way I find out everything. On paper, I said, leave it as it is for now, and I uncapped my father's pen and finished signing where the little tabs told me to sign. Then I asked for a certified copy of the index entry, paid the fee in cash, and walked out into the parking lot with the envelope held flat against my chest. Daniel was in the Norfolk territory that day. It was Tuesday. Of course it was Tuesday. I drove home the long way, along the river. I did not cry. I let Biscuit out into the yard and stood on the porch watching him while the word divorced hung in the March air like weather. And I've been married for 3 years. Daniel came home Wednesday night with a bag of oranges and a story about a contractor in Chesapeake. He kissed my hair and asked about the estate. I said probate was a lot, and he said I looked tired, and both things were true. That night, I lay next to my husband of 14 years, or of 10 years, depending on which of us you asked. And I did what I do when I cannot sleep. I counted, not sheep. Numbers. The house we lay in, $611,800 at the last assessment, both our names on the deed. The joint savings, $47,230. My retirement, $218,940. His retirement, $301,600. On a statement I now realized was years old. And in the estate account, untouched, $8,014,772. That a court records said belonged to a divorced woman. I counted them over and over, like sheep that bite. The fear came in 2 waves. The first was the fear of being wrong. A clerical error, some other Carolyn Langford, something to laugh about at Peggy's fence by summer. That fear was almost sweet, and I distrusted it because it asked me to do nothing. The second wave was worse. If it was real, then for 4 years I had been unmarried without knowing it, and a man who could arrange that could arrange anything. And I've been married for 3 years. What had he signed, bought, promised, or emptied in those 4 years while I filed his socks and straightened my father's photograph? And I've been married for 3 years. And now there was $8 million standing in the middle of my life like a lit window. And I did not know who had been watching the house. At 2:10, I got up, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table. I opened a spreadsheet and named it estate, which was a lie, the first useful lie of my new life. Columns, dates, documents, questions. In the morning, I made his coffee and asked about the contractor by name. He never looked at me twice. It turns out I am good at this. I have decided not to be ashamed of that. I called no one from the house. On Friday, from a cafe on the other side of the river, a place Daniel and I had never been together, I made 2 calls. The first was to Barbara, my oldest friend at Marrow and Lane, who has edited crime novels for 20 years. She was quiet a moment, then said, "Do not touch the joint accounts. Do not move out of that house. And write down everything, starting with the notary's cardigan." The second call was to a law office on the 9th floor downtown. Susan Belair was in her 60s. Silver, hair cropped short, reading glasses on a red cord, a milk glass paperweight shaped like an egg on her desk. And I've been married for 3 years. She read my envelope from Ferris and Vale without expression, took off the glasses, and said, "You've done this correctly. Most people sit in that chair having already made 3 mistakes." Then she said, 2 rules. Don't access anything you're not authorized to access. That can backfire. And keep the inheritance exactly where it is. Not $1 into anything joint. Separate property stays separate only if you never mix it. She explained, in the flat voice of a woman describing plumbing, that a divorce decree obtained with a forged signature is not just unfair. It is a fraud upon the court itself, and a court can undo it no matter how many years have passed. Then she told me what a named party is entitled to. The entire case file, certified. That week, I mailed a request to the clerk of Calder County Circuit Court with a check for $16.50, which remains the best money I have ever spent. The envelope came the following Thursday, a complaint. A waiver of service, bearing my signature, a settlement agreement, bearing it again, a final decree. I laid the pages out on the kitchen table, photographed each one, sent them to Susan, and filed the originals by date, the way I file everything. Somewhere in that week, I stopped protecting the marriage and started protecting the life. They are not the same job. And I did not yet know what the dates on those pages would tell me. That took 3 more weeks, and a calendar I keep better than anyone alive. 3 weeks passed. I know because I numbered them. Here is something true about my profession. I have spent 20 years reading signature pages, and I know what a real signature does. A living hand hesitates differently every time. Week 1, I laid the waiver of service beside the only other major document Daniel and I had ever signed together, our refinance from 2011, because I keep everything. The signature on the waiver was mine. Stroke for stroke. The same lean, the same hesitation in the L, the same tired little tail on the final D. Identical. And that is how I knew it was false. No one signs their name identically twice in one lifetime. Only a photocopy does that. Someone had traced me, or lifted me, off a page I had signed in good faith at 31. Week 2, I hired a man named Gary Sutter, a forensic accountant with the calmest voice I have ever heard. And I've been married for 3 years. His specialty, he said, was following marital money through clean paperwork. In the first 10 minutes, he asked me 2 questions I will remember for the rest of my life. The first, what deposits used to arrive in your joint account that no longer do? The second, which of these accounts have you personally seen a statement for, on paper, in the last 4 years? I opened my mouth to answer the second and found nothing there. He nodded like a doctor hearing a familiar cough, asked for 3 years of records, only the ones with my name on them, and told me to go live my life and let him read. Week 3 belonged to the calendar. Wart thy live by fair calendars the way farmers live by rain, and when I read the waiver as an editor instead of a wife, I saw it. Signed and acknowledged the 11th of April, 4 years ago, before a Virginia notary. The 11th of April. I was in London from the 8th to the 15th that year, at the Spring Rights Fair. There are passport stamps, flights, a hotel folio, a company ledger. On the 11th of April, I was 4,000 miles from Richmond, buying books. Whoever signed that waiver in front of a notary, it was not me, and I could prove it with paper I had never thought of as evidence. At the end of that week, Sutter called. At the end of that week with what he was careful to label a preliminary shape, not a finding. There's an individual account at Crestline Federal Savings, he said, opened 9 days after the decree was entered. I can see the outline of it. A deposit every February. I don't have totals yet. Every February. The Februaries when Daniel rubbed his eyes over the bills and said money was tight. The February the green paint could wait, again, because dark rooms feel smaller, thanked him and said, good. Then let's not stop. Susan filed that Friday. A motion to vacate the decree for fraud upon the court, and beneath it, waiting its turn, a real divorce petition with my real signature. Daniel was served the following Thursday, at his office. He called me 7 times. I did not answer. He came home early and stood in the kitchen, holding the papers like they were wet. Carolyn, that divorce. There's a context, it was a paperwork thing, a tax thing, I was going to. He recalibrated in real time. I watched him reach for the version of himself that could talk anyone into gutters. Daniel, I said, don't. And I took my tea upstairs. 3 days later, a number I didn't know called. A woman's voice, careful and level, said, my name is Dana. I think you already know who I is. She said he had shown her a decree. She said they were married 3 years ago in Kitty Hawk, that she had a certificate with a seal. Her voice held all the way until the end, and then it didn't. I planned a wedding around that piece of paper, she said. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. My attorney may need to speak with you. I can't give you more than that. I hung up gently. I felt no triumph. She was standing in a burning building I had only just escaped, and we had been lied to by the same architect. His next move arrived by mail 8 days later. On good letterhead, I had been told to expect it. Expecting a wave does not stop it from being made of water. The letter came from a law office with 3 names in the title, addressed to Susan, copied to me. I read it standing at the kitchen counter. And then I sat down and read it again, because that is my training. The first read is for the shock, the second is for the sentences. And I've been married for 3 years. It made 3 arguments, and none of them were stupid. First, that the decree was valid and final, and that after 4 years my challenge came too late, that the law does not reward peoples who sleep on their rights. And I've been mise. Second, that the property settlement executed by the parties had resolved everything between us long ago. And since the Richmond house still sat in both names, my husband was entitled to force its sale and take his half. Third, an emergency motion. Freeze the joint accounts. and enjoin any distribution of estate funds until the court could sort out what belonged to whom. A real attorney wrote that letter. It had case citations. For one long minute, I felt the floor move, because paper had already rewritten my life once without my permission, and here was more paper, trying again. Then I did what I do. I opened my spreadsheet, and I went looking for the thing he had gotten wrong. It took 11 minutes. Saw every argument in that letter stood on the settlement agreement. The settlement agreement stood on a signature, and the signature stood on a date, the 11th of April, a day I could account for down to the boarding gate. He had built a courthouse on top of one forged page. Daniel was always better at appearances than at dates. That same week, the outside world made its approach. Mary Ann, Glenn's wife, the one who supposedly never got a name right, called Barbara, because I had stopped answering unknown numbers, and I've been married for 3 years. She said it was all very sad, that there were two sides to everything, and that we should really talk before the lawyers made it ugly. Barbara relayed this at my kitchen table, with her coat still on, so angry her tea went cold. Two sides, she kept saying. Two sides. I was not angry. Mary Ann had addressed that Christmas card honestly 2 winters ago. In her world, Daniel and Dana were the couple, and I was the paperwork. I wrote down the date and time of her call, and sent both to Susan. Because sympathy is information too. Susan's entire response took 3 sentences. This is a standard defensive posture, and we expected it. A freeze motion mostly tells you which accounts a man is nervous about. Sleep well. That evening, I took my father's photograph down from the hallway, carried it into the study with the unpainted walls, and set it on the desk, facing the chair. I didn't straighten it. I let him look at the room where the rest of this work would happen, and I sat with him a while, and the house was very quiet, and for once, the quiet held. On Friday of that week, I gave myself 6 minutes. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, set the timer on my phone, and cried for a marriage that had legally ended 4 years before I found out, which is a strange thing to grieve, like mourning a man who was already buried in a different city. The timer rang. I was not finished. I stopped anyway, washed my face, and went downstairs to edit a manuscript about beekeeping, because bees do not care about Calder County, and that month I loved them for it. Then came the stall. His attorney requested a continuance to retain a handwriting expert of their own, which was reasonable, which was the maddening part. The court had set our hearing for the last week of July. Now it moved to the second week of September. 6 more weeks. Susan called it normal. Delay is the cheapest weapon there is, she said. Let him spend it. 2 things happened in the waiting. The first was a memo from Gary Sutter, marked preliminary, which I read 3 times. The Crestline account was confirmed, opened 9 days after the decree. And there was a second account he had not expected, at a credit union in Chesapeake, held jointly, second name pending subpoena. I emailed him 1 sentence. I think there's more. I was right, though not in the way I expected. The second thing arrived because of what Susan had set in motion. A subpoena had gone to what Susan had set in motion. A subpoena had gone to the title agency in Mechanicsville where Curtis kept his notary journal because Virginia notaries keep journals, and the seal on my waivers was his. Ensues the certified pages came back for the 11th of April. 4 entries, all commercial closings, and my name nowhere on it. A notary who never met me has sworn I appeared before. The week the subpoena landed, Curtis resigned from the agency to spend more time with his family. And I've been married for 3 years. Golf invitations stopped arriving in fat white envelopes. Susan asked whether we should compel Dana to testify. Her statement would help, and her presence would help more. And I've been married for 3 years. I thought about a level voice on the phone, saying she had planned a wedding around a piece of paper. No, I said. She was lied to in a courthouse, too. Get what she offers freely, and leave her out of that room. Susan looked at me a moment longer than usual and wrote something down. When I filed, the dogwoods were blooming. By the time we walked into that hearings, by the time we light had gone the color of cider. The hearing was held in a conference room at the courthouse annex. A long table, blinds striping the September light, a court reporter, water in paper cones that no one drank. Daniel sat across from me in a gray suit I had never seen, with a new haircut, worrying the corner of a legal pad with his thumbnail. He had not looked at me since the hallway. Susan built it the way you build anything that has to stand. First, the foundation. The certified file from Calder County, complaint, waiver, settlement, decree, entered one page at a time. Second, the money. Gary Sutter walked the room through it in his calm voice. An individual account at Crestline Federal Savings opened 9 days after the decree was entered. 4 deposits, one every February. 44,000. 100. 46,700. 47,300. 48,300. $186,400 in total. His bonus was paid separately from salary, Sutter said, every February. Until the year of the decree, those deposits reached the joint account. After it, they didn't. The decree was the account's opening document. It was, functionally, a key. Then the credit union account in Chesapeake, held jointly with Dana M. Hargrove. Then a townhouse deed, Gorns recorded 3 years ago, grantee described in his own filing as Daniel Hargrove, divorced. Third, the journal. The certified pages from Mechanicsville, the 11th of April, 4 commercial closings, and no Carolyn Langford. His attorney objected once, to foundation. Susan answered once, with the custodian's certificate, and the objection sat down and stayed down. Into the record, too, went 2 lines from Curtis's deposition, read aloud by the reporter, that Daniel had covered $15,000 of his card debt that spring. And that, he had been told, it was just paperwork, to spare Carolyn a court date. I wanted to believe that, the transcript said, so I did. Then Susan slid 1 more page across, a letter from the operations office at Merrow and Lane, certifying the travel ledger, flights, hotel folio, badge scans from the London Fair, the 8th through the 15th of April, my passport stamps appended. The person who signed that waiver on the 11th of April signed it in Richmond, Susan said. Mrs. Langford was 4,000 miles away, buying books. I watched Daniel, read the page and watched his pen stop moving, and in the quiet I heard 4 whispered words meant only for his attorney. You said it was handled. His attorney requested a recess. That was the surrender. Everything after was arithmetic. I looked at the window and Susan leaned over and said 1 sentence. Drink your water. This part belongs to us. The part belongs to us. By the last Friday of September, there was an agreed order and a settlement signed in that same room in light the color of brass. The decree was vacated as a fraud upon the court. And the real claim divorce went through on real terms. He quitclaimed his interest in the Richmond house, all $611,800 of it, to me. He agreed to repay $93,200, half of the diverted bonuses, over 24 months, and $11,500 in fees. My inheritance was confirmed, in writing, as separate property, never commingled, never his. And one condition of mine that had no number on it, a sworn affidavit recorded with the court stating that the signature of the 11th of April was not mine, so that I'd been married for 3 years, so that no clerk's index anywhere would ever again call me divorced on a day I was buying books. As for the forgery and the false notarization, Susan said it plainly in the hallway. Those aren't mine to bargain with. And I've been married for 3 years. They go to the Commonwealth's attorney. What the system does with them is the system's business. I signed everything with my father's pen. 14 months have passed since the last Friday of September. The study is green now, the deep, quiet green I bought 3 cans ago. I painted it myself over a long weekend, 2 coats, windows open, Biscuit supervising from the doorway, gray chin on his paws. He is slower these days, and he follows me from room to room like a small opinion. My father's photograph stands on the shelf above the desk, in the same pewter frame, and it sits perfectly level, and I have not straightened it once. I do the Sunday crossword in pen, alone, and I no longer think of that as a smaller life. Last April, I went to London, and on the 11th I bought a first novel about a lighthouse keeper's daughter. And I signed the offer with my father's pen, and I sat in the hotel bar afterward and laughed at something I have never explained to anyone. As for Daniel, charges were filed in February, forgery and false notarization, 2 counts of each, and that file moves on the system's own schedule now, not mine. He no longer works for the distributor. He rents a place near the airport. Curtis surrendered his notary commission and is named in the same file. And Dana had the Kitty Hawk marriage annulled, a certificate voided by an older lie. We do not speak. I did not go looking for any of this information. Some things simply find you, the way an invoice does. Here is what I know now that I did not know that winter. A signature is such a small thing, an inch of ink, half a second of your hand. It turns out whole lives balance on whether it is truly yours. So protect the life, not the marriage. The marriage was only